Hi there. First, before I even jump into remarks, I just want to congratulate the organizers of this forum. It is a difficult task sometimes to bring together truly interdisciplinary events, and that's absolutely what they've done here. And so it really is exciting to be a part of that. Now, one of the big challenges with interdisciplinary events is that once the novelty's worn off with regards to everybody being excited to realize that we have at least a topical interest in common, the challenge then is to figure out, well, how can we productively talk to one another? Now, what is it that we each are bringing to the table that we might be able to give to those other folks who are here? And so I spent some time thinking about this because there actually are a couple of different ways that I could potentially contribute, at least in a small way, to this discussion. I'm a social scientist, and I've done some work that's directly relevant. We've worked on large national surveys of public understanding of energy. I've done some work on behavioral intervention related to demand reduction, and we'll talk a little bit about that, or I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But a lot of my career as a social scientist who has specifically been focused on looking at and understanding the effects of behavioral intervention that have a communication component. A lot of that work, what I've been trying to do is work on what are seemingly mundane questions, but those that turn out to be really important. Work to track behavior, and to also look at and make sure that we are attributing credit for interventions in appropriate ways. Now, that ties in directly with some of the remarks, all the way from Ken's remarks this morning, and it echoes throughout. This notion of how is it that we actually know that what we're doing is having an impact, how is it that we can measure and assess. And so from that standpoint, what I actually want to talk about today, now earlier with Michael and Alex suggested that those folks who are working in public health have all these grand successes to talk about. And I'd actually think that we'd have a more productive discussion talking about failure. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the failures that we've had in trying to track and discern some of these behavioral effects. Because I think out of some of that measurement discussion, we've learned some lessons about how it is that communication programs can and operate. And I also think that there's a possibility for us to avoid, at this really critical point, some missteps. Missteps that we might make if we were to just look at the literature as it exists now and to say, here's the potential for communication-based behavioral intervention. Because I think, frankly, if you look at some of the most carefully controlled, prominent articles that are out there over the last 40 or 50 years related to health behavior, that actually you might look at some of those and say, I don't know. I'm not sure that there's really a whole lot of bang for the buck there in terms of communication-based behavioral intervention. We might look at other things. Well, I actually think that that story is one that's not quite, wouldn't be complete, and I want to help us to avoid that possibility now as we're kind of thinking about planning and adoption of particular policy levers, because I actually think that there is potential in these arenas, in this arena, and I think it's one that we really need to look more carefully at how it is that we're evaluating and planning for doing this kind of work. Okay. So how is it that we've come to make some of these mistakes along the way? Well, part of it is really a story about evaluation. In many of our heads, I think there's at least a folk theory as to how it is that communication-based intervention might work. That somehow we would expose an audience, a group, a community to a message. That there would be an initial broadcast of that message somehow. And that somehow along the way there would be some degree of audience engagement with that information that in turn would result in outcomes, whether they be behaviors or other things down the line. Okay? What we often do, though, and this is not necessarily to fault the researchers working in this area, but rather just to say we don't necessarily have as much understanding as we should. What we often do is do something simple like this. We have an intent to treat model where folks are exposed and we look for outcomes. And the problem with that is that I think that the way that information and the way the audience is engaged with information, the notion of exposure and what counts as direct and indirect exposure, all those things that I'll explore here in just a minute, tends to discount and maybe undermine the clarity that we could have otherwise about how it is that these types of efforts might have had an impact over time. Okay? So that's the underlying notion that we're going to learn from some methodological mistakes perhaps along the way, but hopefully pick up some ideas about how it is that these interventions can work. And I think the underlying theme is that a lot of this work is both more powerful but also a lot messier than we might otherwise anticipate. And that's a story that I think needs to be told. So just a quick primer or reminder maybe for some of you as to what it is that messages can do. And the whole point of this graph is just to suggest there are more than one thing. This is not exhaustive or extensive at all, but rather just illustrative of the fact that there are many things that happen when you release information out into the world. Okay? At the point of engagement itself, and some people might be exposed, some people might not, but then there's all kinds of things that are happening in terms of attention. Right now, I'm hoping to broadcast to all of you some brief words, but there are all kinds of structural factors, fatigue, hunger, other things, distraction, that may or may not even be allowing you to really carefully attend to what I'm saying. Over and above this, we could look at what happens if I were to have been here giving these messages and not, in a very carefully, randomly assigned version of the world. And even under that circumstance, we might look for your immediate follow-up behaviors. There are lots of things that we could actually look to measure. Okay? We could look at whether or not there was some degree of buzz or conversation sparked as a result of this. We could look at specific behaviors that are of the sort that we often think about in terms of adoption of retrofits or other types of things. But there's a constellation of behaviors often that homeowners and consumers often engage in. Along the way, there are all kinds of intermediate outcomes as well. And those are things that I want us to attend to. Okay? One important message is just the simple notion that a communication-based intervention may or may not have to lead to belief change per se in order to actually have an effect. We see a really important literature developing, for example, in the mobile messaging arena that suggests that prompts and reminders, which are not necessarily changing underlying beliefs per se, those prompts and reminders can actually trigger behavior in important ways. And there's some examples, I'm sure there's some of those that we'll end up talking about a little bit later on. Well, what matters from the standpoint of intervention and policy choice and decision making is that the design of those types of programs looks a little bit different than what you might do to try and put a full court press on to change somebody's belief. The structure of, the nature of communication strategies, all of that is going to reflect how it is that you think these messages are actually operating. So there's a really complex arena here worthwhile to pay attention to. Okay, so along the way I promised some effort to look at some failures. One of those is at a very basic spot. You might think that communication research is really expert at assessing and measuring exposure. And we've done reasonably well. We've improved over time, but we certainly are far from perfect in this regard. There are a lot of things that you could do. You could imagine trying to measure later recall of some very specific messages. So imagine I had some elements in this slide, and then later, and you're all walking to dinner, somebody walked up to you and asked you for very specific recognition of particular content pieces. That's fine. That's not necessary, and there's actually some good evidence that I've worked on and others have as well, that by and large you can make some progress in that regard. But there are complications along the way, and things that are missed if you look at things in a very specific way to sort of assess what parts of a campaign or an intervention people may specifically remember. First of all, we know that recognition is not a perfect indicator of even memory for content. There are all kinds of different memory systems that vary as a function of age, it varies as a function of other types of variables, and we know that even verbatim recognition is not actually the only indicator of whether or not you've bumped into or been exposed to information. In addition, and this is maybe the more subtle and interesting point, indirect exposure is often missed. So imagine that I offer some degree of information to you. You then turn around and through a variety of processes that's rambling around in your head, and then you end up having a conversation with somebody on the phone that's indirectly linked. It's the same topical area. I've somehow changed some aspect or made more salient certain ideas, and then this other person that is talking to the person who is exposed then turns around and changes their behavior. Well, I've had an impact. But if I go and try to measure whether or not that person who is indirectly exposed remembers a specific campaign slogan, they probably aren't going to because they weren't directly measured in the first place. This is a big and fundamental mistake that we often make because we're often looking to try to be experimentally tight in our and carefully controlled work to figure out whether or not people have both the original slogan or piece of content in their head and they've performed a particular behavior. In addition, all this communication work happens in a multi-level context. And this is not an audience that I need to work very hard to convince, I imagine, in that regard. But structural factors, other things that might condition response are sometimes left out of the equation. And I really think that the best work in this area is that which is done with multi-level modeling and at least embraces a multi-level approach. We can talk more about that a little bit later. Okay. So this notion of indirect exposure, this is something that I explore and others have, as well, with an increasing emphasis on social networks. Now, Catherine just a moment ago noted the social side of all of this, and I want to raise a couple of examples of how this is, the case. And so, all this is to suggest that social diffusion processes actually might be something that are worthwhile for evaluators to engage. We see a good example of this from a smoking cessation evaluation in the Netherlands, where the researchers looked at direct indicators of direct campaign exposure, and what they ended up finding and concluding was that actually direct campaign exposure did not tell the whole story, but rather once you started to incorporate those interpersonal exchanges, those discussions, you actually were able to find a much stronger base of evidence for the effect of the campaign on smoking cessation over time. Exposure led to interpersonal talk, which in turn led to cessation amongst folks who were not directly exposed. There are lots of ways you can model this empirically. I won't get into a lot of that discussion, but one result is to look at sort of community level indicators of, just as we might think about air pollution and exposure there, information environments in the same way. And that's something that I hopefully inspire you to think about a little bit, because I think there's a lot to be learned from the epi literature as we try to look at communication and social science in this arena. But I also want to raise a cautionary note, because I think that there is sometimes a tendency to think that, well, we can maybe use some of these social diffusion processes to spread the word. And I actually think that there's reason to worry about that slightly. What we might end up doing is reifying some of the social differences that we have right now. What we often see in social diffusion processes is that the information rich get richer, that there's an amplification in certain corners, and that there are certain audiences that aren't socially connected, and that we don't necessarily see this kind of diffusion. This is easily remembered with an example. This is true in all kinds of network literature around the world, and it's a somewhat crass example, but you'll remember it later on. I was at an outdoor concert a number of years ago, and there's a long array of portable bathrooms and toilets. And one of the interesting phenomena was that there was not an equal distribution of people in lines at all of these, but there was an intense clustering at those that were closest to the concert venue. Now, obviously, there might have been some degree of inebriation that also explained behavior, but regardless, there should have been folks who were willing to sort of fill out all of these stalls. But instead, I think there was a tendency for people to assume that something important was happening with the choices initial folks were making, and there's a clustering over time. We see this in all kinds of networks, that those networks that start out with a lot of interconnected nodes tend to stay that way and grow more over time. So keep that in mind in advocating for social diffusion. There's just a cautionary note there. Okay, well, how does any of this relate to energy use behavior? Well, at least on that one notion, in terms of social diffusion, social influence, there are some good examples of this. A colleague of mine and I recently worked specifically to predict weatherization behavior. So, one of those mundane behaviors, as we heard at the keynote address at lunch, that turned out to be important. And one of the questions we asked was, over and above everything else, can social engagement actually matter? Or, a little bit more colloquially, can talking predict caulking? Well, it turns out I wouldn't have it up on the slide if it didn't. And so we actually did find that that was the case. That there were a number of factors that predicted weatherization: home ownership, age of property, but social interaction also seemed to predict weatherization. So the degree to which you were in active information sharing networks, those were the folks who were most likely later, subsequently, to produce weatherization. Okay, so this is important, I think, to keep in mind, because this is something we might have missed if we only looked at those households that were just exposed to a brochure that we sent out per se, and then we went and later followed up with them. There's some degree of leaking out of information and diffusion that matters in consequential ways. So a lot of this is, as we had alluded to earlier, there is this growth, in interesting, journals and places and forums for discussion. There's a new journal called Energy Research and Social Science where a lot of this is being gathered, and you'll find that paper there recently. The other thing I want to briefly allude to, and then I'll wrap up here, is just to note that I think there's really interesting social science work to be done outside of just specific interventions, but work that could actually recognize the changes in information environments over time. What we might label as culture change, if we think about culture as a network of ideas that evolves in a longitudinal way over time, that probably accounts for some of the consumer-based energy efficiency behavior changes that we've seen. There has been a lot of work to do this in the health arena. For example, you see folks that have tried to track smoking in movies, and movies as an indicator of wider popular culture content. We could be doing similar things, I think, in this arena as well to see. We see there are instances where this has impacts on policy decisions, but also on behaviors. And I think that work really requires that you have a broader view of how it is that people engage with their information environment, what it is that we're tracking over time, and how it is that there's an ebb and flow that really matters in important ways. Okay. The last notion from a measurement perspective that I want to raise is just that actual measurement of behavior obviously is paramount, but we often spend time trying to measure intention. And measurement of intention is a reasonable step to take, but intention, first of all, isn't always a perfect indicator of behavior. But I also, and this is the important point for the work that you all are thinking about, hypothetical or novel behaviors pose particular measurement problems from a self-reported intention perspective. This is true for novel products in the smoking arena or the smokeless tobacco arena with regards to something like dissolvable tobacco. We saw this happen in an instance where people were reporting on hypothetical domestic abuse amongst neighbors and what their response would be to that. We might see work like that happening, Caitlin Toner, who was mentioned earlier, David Hess, others in the audience, as you think about issues like smart meter use that are, to some degree, for some people, hypothetical or novel. And for those instances, behavioral willingness or openness to hypothetical or future situations, there's a measurement move there that I think needs to happen for us to be able to detect what it is that people would do in the future. And just to remember, the key takeaway is that it's sometimes difficult for people to say what they're going to do with regards to a new behavior or set of ideas that's different than what they've had available to them previously. Okay. So a quick summary then. So this quick tour through some of the challenges we've faced in terms of basic measurement issues, I think opens up some interesting theoretical directions for us to consider. Indirect exposure and social network diffusion are important. They need to be at the table as part of your discussion. There are things that can be done at a community level in terms of measurement and attribution of credit for programs that haven't always been done, that should be done before we make a decision, yes, no, as to whether or not to adopt some of these programs. Longitudinal designs are really critical. We heard from folks studying cancer, so it makes sense in that case to look over time, but I think some of the impacts of some of these programs probably also take a while to percolate. And then we probably need to do better in terms of measurement, so behavioral willingness might be another direction to go as well. Just a couple of quick plugs and then I'll jump off the stage. Some of this is actually part of a discussion that we had earlier this spring, and a summit was held at Duke University, and we'll be putting that together into an edited volume on innovations in home energy use motivation or behavioral interventions, and I'd be happy for folks that are here to offer a free copy of that, and so if you're interested, just send me an email at bsouthwell@rti.org. That'll be available a little bit later on in 2015. The other thing that I'll note is that sitting there today has really brought home the degree to which a lot of this intersects with a new social science public radio show that we've been putting together, where we've had topics such as public perception of fracking and home energy use. For those of you that might be interested, I'd encourage you to go on social media, follow Measure Radio. You might have ideas about future guests, but a lot of this work is directly relevant, and so it was nice and gratifying to see that connection. Okay, I will jump off the stage here with that, but thank you very much for your attention.